Between the last episode and this episode, I took an opportunity to get a little bit of work done building the inner support for the tilt cylinders. Cut out a little rectangle of brass, started working on these side components here. These will get a little bit more detailing later. As you can see, I just used a little bit of square tubing to kind of square the thing up. Soldering it together was still challenging, even though I have this new soldering unit, but it came out well. And then I cut these little ears. So the next thing to do is I'm going to bend some brass that's going to go between these two components to fill in this medium space in there. And I have to put in these two little pieces of metal that will act as hangers. And then this is going to get soldered in place, unless I drop it down inside there like that. But I have a way of actually holding it in place level with the rest of this. After that, we'll move on to building the bottom, and then the bottom except for the axle, and then the articulation points. So I got a little chunk of brass here. We're not going to CNC this one. It's pretty straightforward. I just need to clean up the edges and then start bending it out. Something I got done recently, and I don't think I showed it to you guys, I ended up finally putting a port in the side of my CNC enclosure to allow me to run a hose out to connect to my tools. So when I'm working on the bench like this, I don't have the risk of getting a whole ton of dust all over the place. The vacuum port will now allow me to keep it a little bit more contained. There still is some dust that's going to get out, but compared to how it used to be, it's a lot cleaner, which I like. So one of the hardest parts about hand bending is keeping your bends even and finding leverage to get bending pressure on thicker pieces of brass. Sometimes you have to improvise, and it doesn't always work out, but sometimes it does. I was able to use various tools and methods to get the bends for this tiny little piece to come out correctly. And even used a little piece of brass to hammer the shape, and was able to get everything to line up relatively well. And then using that same piece of brass that I used to shape it as a base support piece for when I went to solder the piece on the front frame for its final assembly. Make sure you always rough the surface up before you apply flux. Sometimes this brass is coated in something and it makes it a little bit harder for the solder to adhere to the metal. I was able to use a piece of brass rod to help line all the pieces up, and then applied a wet piece of paper towel to the back of it to help keep it cooled down before soldering. And then at this point I was still pretty early on in getting to know this soldering unit, so I was a bit apprehensive about getting the piece too close to other pieces that I had already soldered. But after using it for a little bit, I figured out that I actually could do that without breaking the other solders. And another nice little bonus I realized is that I could use the tip to take the excess solder and flatten it out so that I'd have less to have to sand down later. I'd say that new soldering iron is really starting to earn its keep. I don't think I would have been able to pull off something quite as complex with a torch. Maybe I could have, but it would have been a lot more difficult to set up. But it looks like everything held together. I was worried that I'd lose the seam back here, but I put a little wet paper towel on there. That seemed to work out pretty good. But it's all held together pretty well. The next piece to install is the base plate for the entire front frame. This one was a bit of a doozy, thicker brass, so I needed to make sure that my bends were all lined up perfectly straight, because trying to make fixes on this later would have been pretty difficult. Alright, so my options for bending right now are kind of limited. I have this, and then there's the vise method that I use, and then I have another vise brake, but it's meant for right angles, and I've tried using it before to do non-right angles, and it kind of curves all the metal. It doesn't work out quite right What I need is one of those breaks that has the strip that you slide this under, and then you can fold a piece of metal up to bend it. But the only ones that I've found are really, really big, too big for my workshop. So those are kind of out of the question for right now. What I think I can do is use this to get it started. Now, I'll roll the wheels out here, drop the blade back. There's this little piece inside here that drops down to that groove, and that piece is what aids you in bending the metal, because the metal drops down into this groove here, and it folds the metal up. Now this groove is thinner than the metal that I'm bending, thus it's not going to do me any favors if I try to bend it with this. It's really thick metal too, and I can't get a lot of leverage with these. But what I think I can do is get the bend started without this in there. So I'm going to give it a try, and I'm going to try it on a piece of scrap first just to see what it does. And then if I do like the outcome, then I can use it to get the bend started, and then I'll finish it off on the vise. All right, let's see how that turned out. Oh, not bad at all. Well, that's really good. This metal is only 0.2 millimeters thinner than the metal that I'm about to bend, but that actually worked out really well. It gave me a good start. So let's give it a try. All right, here we go. Alright, so I think that's all the bending brake wants to give me without putting up too much of a fight. And again, it's made out of aluminum, so I don't want to put too much pressure on it and break it. Let's take this out and see what we got started. Okay, it wasn't as straightforward as I had hoped, but still looking pretty good here. Focus the camera. Whoop. Butterfingers looking pretty spiffy. Need to get that soldered on there. It wasn't as straightforward as I thought it would be. I did have to do just a little bit of grinding here because this wasn't all flat, and then a little bit of hammering and touching up needed to be done on this in order to get all the bends to come out right. But I think we're looking pretty good. So I'm going to solder this together, and then I'll add the side pieces once this is done. To get a little clever here with the rigging this thing up for soldering. Tried using little vices and all sorts of stuff to try to hold this together, but I ended up just grabbing some wire here. I took one of those long twisty ties and took the inside wire out of it so that I can bind this up so that it's all nice and tight. So now I can apply some flux to it and use some solder. Trim these back. That came out good. This is getting very heavy. Right, so the next piece to install here is that side panel. I needed to make a minor adjustment to the bottom of that panel because during the bending process it seemed to concave the bottom plate just a little bit, so some adjustments were needed to make it fit in place. But overall, I think it turned out pretty well, and I was lucky to be able to line it up again at the top with a piece of brass tubing. Looking pretty swell. This will get cut off. I know it's not supposed to be there. I left myself some extra length just in case I needed it, but happy with it so far. Alright, I'm making the upper mount for the center pin here, and putting the hole in the back of this plate was really terrifying. Like mounting it back into a vise and aligning it with the CNC machine and cutting the hole in, and it came out good except for one detail. Got it a little too high there, a bit of an oopsie daisy, but I recut the hole a little bit lower and then made a little spacer that fits in, so everything is honky-dory. And now I just need to solder all of this in place. Alright, installed and feeling pretty solid. Next, let's do the final piece for retaining the pins, and that's going to be this component that's going to go in here. I cut it basically based off the original shape on the bottom here, but it's about 1 millimeter long, so I need to trim that out. And then we will solder it in place. Alright, ground the back of this off, so now that it fits in line with the rest of the base. But I did notice something here, so I installed this little piece on top of the base plate. Adds a little bit more detail, makes it a little bit more realistic, but it's off a little bit. It's off this direction just a tad. I'm not going to unsolder that because it's sandwiched on there. The solder is sandwiched between the two pieces of metal, and to get enough heat to take this entirely off would compromise the other solders in the area, so I'm going to leave it be. What I'm going to do instead is just outline the little bit of overhang that's right there and then trim it off by itself. And the holes that are in here aren't the actual size that they're going to be for the pin. They're undersized intentionally just in case I did what I did right here, so I'll be able to drill the actual size hole through without having to worry too much about the hole being off. Next time I'm not going to pre-drill the holes. I'm going to do it all at the end because I'm finding now that trying to get all these holes to line up is more work than it's worth. But it's all coming out pretty good, and this is actually one piece of metal. I just stepped it because that's how it looks on the real machine, and I wanted to give it some more detail, and then I'll get in here and grind this back later to smooth it out. Alright, so the back of this is done for the most part. Some little details that are going to go on later, but for right now it is done. This was not easy to install, having to put something that's going to go straight perpendicular to the back of it, and then I was able to install these little bits here with the tweezers. Tried using the tweezers for this one first, just didn't generate enough heat, so I used the probe. Nice thing about the probe is I've found that it does a really good job of finishing off the solder and mowing it down so that it kind of flows right into the shape. And then I got the top installed as well. You can see our little patch job there. That'll get grinded out, smoothed out later. And then I also installed the holes. There's a couple tiny little pieces that need to get installed on the front of this before this is complete for my current purposes. We'll get the detailed parts on later, lights, fenders, all that stuff later on in the series, but I just wanted to focus on the frame. So let's get the rest of the frame stuff installed. I want to get this pan installed that goes inside here. So it's kind of a tricky one, but I found a method to hold this in place because you can see it's a little loose there. So let's get to it. All right, first, let's get a little bit of solder paste on here. Alright, Alright, so I have it mounted up in the vise here. I got the trusty, gross looking wet towel wrapped around it. That's to minimize the heat going to the other parts of the model. Even though this does a pretty good job of isolating it to just a spot where we're going to solder, I don't want to take any chances after all the hours that we've put into the rest of this frame. So, let's get to it. Again, this is pedal activated, so I can touch it to where I need it, and then hit the pedal when I'm ready to rock and roll. And just walk along. Real cool thing about these tips is it's just a carbon rod that's coated in brass, so you can take and use a pencil sharpener to sharpen it up and bring a point back into it. Now I'll let you guys in on a little secret with this probe. I have actually taken and reamed the spot where it goes into the handpiece out a little bit more so that I can just use welding rods. To give you an idea, the replacement tips for these are like 29 bucks for 6 of these tips, which is ridiculous when you can just put in a cutting rod and get the exact same thing done. So I think this is good. You can see a little discoloration of the metal right there. It means I got it pretty hot. So I'm going to let that cool down and then take it out of the vise and have a look, see if it's done. All right, moment of truth. Yes, that is not the dinner bell, that is the solder bell. So, looking pretty good. And the next piece just gets installed right over there, but this guy's not quite ready to go on yet. There's a I need to use this as basically a template for a little detail piece that's going to go over this. This essentially has a hatch on the front of it, right? So I'm going to use a really thin piece of brass to create that hatch. That'll go on later, but I just want to get it done right now, or at least the cutting it out. We'll do that later on. Let's get to the next piece. Alright, so the last little bit of frame that I want to install on this episode are these little supports that go in between these two pieces of frame. And you can see I already got that one installed, and then here is one of them uninstalled, and it has a little bit of a bend to it that follows the various contours of the frame. I have it pressure fit in place, and then I'm going to put the solder on there. We'll get these guys in and see how they look. Alright, so I alluded to this a few minutes ago, but I didn't really finish what I was talking about. The tips in here are carbon that are plated in copper. And what I ended up doing was I drilled this out just a little bit more so that I can put in a tip that was just slightly wider than the one that came with it. And the reason I did that is because the tips that came with this thing are like 29 bucks for a tip that's like this size. To put that into perspective, I can get a box of 100 gouging rods for $30, and I will never need to buy rods again for the remainder of the time that I use this thing, I'm guessing. To do so, I had to ream this out just a little bit, probably voided the warranty, but this is actually pretty simple construction, so I think if this ever burns out, anything goes wrong with this, I could probably fix it, or I could just send it back and pay to have it fixed. And the cool thing is because these are made out of carbon, they're essentially like a pencil without wood, so you can just take a pencil sharpener and sharpen it to get a tip back on it. And then as these get worn out and get too short to be useful, then I can put a new one in. But there are definitely ways to save money. Sometimes you have to be a little bit more creative, but I figure I would have probably burned through 6 of these tips in like, I don't know, a year or two. Now that I have a 100-pack of the rods, which look like this, I can just cut off as much as I need and I'm good to go. So each rod probably will get me 4 tips. I don't have to worry about sharpening this thing every couple times to get more use out of it. You can also file it into a chisel, whatever you want. Just makes it a little bit easier to get your work done. And there we go. Right, this is done. I mean, as far as like being a frame is concerned, it's done. There's some little details that need to go on. Some of it will correlate with other parts down the line in the build. But as far as like the frame, the front frame, this thing is done. Obviously going to add the face. There's 2 little, like, I think they're loops for lifting the frame with a crane that will go up here on the top. Still need the coupling points for the hydraulics for the articulation. Need to do a lot of cleanup on the soldering and on some of the joints, and then that shield needs to get installed in the front. But other than that, it's done. I'm really happy with it. This is insane. Like, looking at it compared to this piece, I really made a lot of progress in the build, and I think it's gonna continue to get more progressive as we move along here. I haven't pinned it together yet. I did stuff a little bit of brass through there just to make sure that it actually articulates, but it's looking pretty good. Anyways, guys, I really appreciate you guys watching, sticking around for this process. This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot on it, and I'm glad I put as much detail into it as I did. I don't think you can ever regret putting too much detail into it. Sure takes a lot more time, but in the end, it's really worth it. Man, we got a lot of cleanup work to do, though. Anyways, you guys have a great week, and I will see you on the next one. Adios.